That time I got reincarnated as a demon lord. English, by LordedoMal44. 21 Rigor vs. Gelmit. Due to the pressure of Rigor's magic, the tension in the air increased greatly, making Gelmit able to perceive the presence of the goblin in front of him. That amount of magic was unrealistic for a goblin, and it was emanating unsteadily as a testament to his wrath. This was something Gelmit would expect coming from an ogre, not a goblin. Gelmit felt as if another ogre was standing in front of him. This made Gelmit nervous. After all, in front of him was a goblin who had heard what he said a little earlier, and if this goblin told the ogres about what had happened, he could become a real threat to their plans, and to the plan that his great master had prepared for so many years. Still, something about this goblin before him seemed unusual to Gelmit, though he couldn't say for sure what that something was. Wait. A hobgoblin so powerful it could only be a named individual. If I think about it, he does look like the worm I named. What is his real name? And, following that train of thought, Gelmit forced his own mind to remember what name he bestowed on that goblin. It's not like Gelmit wasted any time remembering each of the names he gave to the worms in his path, but he really wanted to remember this one. You are Rigor, aren't you? Gelmit mentally thanked the fact that his brain was so genius that he saved namespaces for creatures as insignificant as the worms in his path, proof of his great humility. So, knowing that this was the goblin he had named, Gelmit calmed down. After all, what other reason would there be such a powerful goblin in this forest? There's no way some other Majin is naming creatures in this forest, so most likely the goblin evolved with time and effort, just as a worthy subordinate should. Gelmit even felt a little sorry for knowing that he would kill the goblin in the future when he had the chance to find the Orc Lord and name him. There was only one problem at the moment. How much of what he said had Rigor heard, and how would Gelmit persuade the goblin? Well, if Gelmit really wanted to persuade the goblin, he would need to approach him first. So my dear named son, what do you do so close to D? You're not even able to tell me apart from my brother, are you? And, as soon as he heard those words from the goblin, the Majin couldn't help but be surprised. Brother. In fact, the goblin named Rigor had a younger brother, but he was even weaker than Rigor himself, so how could the goblin in front of him be that weak and skinny brother of his named warrior? Still, in the eyes of the goblin that stood in front of him, Gelmit could see the hatred the goblin carried for mistaking him for his brother. This, combined with the fact that monsters who were very weak were incapable of lying, confirmed that what he said was true. This really was the younger brother of their named warrior. I am impressive. How could you evolve so much? Maybe you have more potential than your brother. Gelmit muttered the last part more to himself, figuring that perhaps he had chosen the wrong brother and that he should have selected the youngest and not the oldest. If he did that, it could be that the goblin in front of him would be much more useful than his brother, who was just a weak goblin hob. Still, why not name him now? Since he didn't name an ogre, he could name the goblin now and get a powerful subordinate, one who could help him get revenge. And with that in mind, and unaware of the rage rising within the goblin's heart, Gelmit decided to give the goblin a name. Very well, so you can go even further than the silly older brother. I'll give you a name. Aren't I a generous person? Gelmit did not receive an answer and, figuring that the goblin was too emotional to speak, he prepared to give him a name. Besides, Gelmit could already imagine how he'd be crying with happiness once he got the name, as all those pathetic goblins did. After all, who among the weak wouldn't cry with joy when a strong one shows him favor? His name will be Re-A-A-H. Before he could finish speaking, Gelmit felt one of his fingers being ripped to the base by an arrow. Upon seeing which direction the arrow came from, Gelmit found the goblin he was trying to name with a bow and arrow made of bluish wood in his hands. It was pretty obvious who had shot the arrow in this situation. My name is Rigor. I am the one who inherited my dear older brother's name now that he rests in peace. And I swear on my brother's behalf that I will eliminate the worm that thought he could play with our lives. With those words, Rigor took another arrow from his quiver and readied his bow, getting into position to shoot right away. The battle between a mighty Majin and a skilled hobgoblin was about to begin. Rigor fired his bow once more, this time aiming for Gelmit's head. He could only dodge the arrow for a short distance, proof that these arrows travel at surprising speed, and this was made even more clear by the scratch that was etched into his mask, which the arrow had scratched. Of course, Seeing this made Gelmit realize the real danger of this situation. After all, if he hadn't dodged he would have been killed. Gelmit could not have imagined that this hobgoblin was this strong. Tisk. I thought I could gain something from you, but if you're going to oppose me, then I'll crush you just like the others. Death March Dance. As Gelmit shouted this, 5 luminous red orbs of light appeared over his palm, guided by his will, and fired at Rigger. All the spheres went at high speed towards Rigger, hitting the exact spot where he was and causing a big bang and explosion. Well, of course I didn't worry about Rigger. After all, I was the one who trained him. This speed is nothing for the current Rigger. Did you think you could beat me with just that? Oh, the coup. Gelmit didn't have time to finish his sentence, being forced to dodge an arrow that went towards his leg. Although he dodged it, the side of the Majin's calf began to bleed, proof that he couldn't entirely avoid the damage. Well, if the arrow had hit him directly, he would have lost his leg, so he can just be happy with the bleeding. Don't think too much, Goblin. Gelmit, driven by rage, launched another Death March dance towards Rigger, with the red orbs going in various directions and converging towards Rigger. He was trying to seal off Rigger's escape routes, an understandable if useless strategy against the Rigger I trained. After all, it doesn't matter which direction Gelmit tries to attack from as long as Rigger can use Shadow Step to escape, as he did before. As he had done the previous time, Rigger escaped through its shadow to a tree opposite where he was, out of Gelmit's line of sight, and kept himself covered with the concealment technique. Because of this, he could easily reload his bow with an arrow and shoot from the Majin's blind spot, ripping off one of his legs. Ah! You bastard, I won't forgive you. I don't seek your forgiveness, Majin. Rigger closed the distance between him and Gelmit at breakneck speed, using one of the Battle Spirit's speed techniques, and then he appeared practically on top of Gelmit himself before he knew it. I seek to send you to hell, cursed creature. Instead of using the bow and arrow, out of anger, Rigger held one of his arrows in his hand and pierced the eyehole in Gelmit's mask, causing the Majin to scream and cry as his left eye bled. Ah! You damn it! You damn it! Gelmit tried to fire at Gelmit, but before he could, a kick from Rigger knocked him away, scattering the Majin's technique in the process. It was probably a combination of pain and surprise, but all of Gelmit's concentration disappeared from the combat, and with Rigger's kick, Gelmit flew until he crashed into a tree, leaving a crack in it. Honestly, Rigger impressed me. Facing Gelmit, who has an absurdly higher amount of Magiculas than he does, toe-to-toe, it seems my training was very effective. This was practically a one-sided fight. The battle spirit techniques taught by the sage were very strong. Rigger, by placing his aura on the arrows, which were already powerful just by being fired by the enchanted bow, managed to increase their potency even more. Honestly, at this point, maybe not even enchanted armor could protect a warrior from Rigger's arrows. And against Gelmit, a mage who can't hit his spells, he practically doesn't stand a chance. This fight, as far as I can see, is already won. With that in mind, Rigger took a small dagger from his back, prepared to end the life of the unconscious Gelmit. I, on the other hand, just watched, wanting to see how far my subordinate could go, until... Caution. My future forecast, my 6 supernatural senses, allowed me to see what would happen, so I alerted Rigger. He was partially distracted by my scream, but at the same time he was alert enough to realize the attack he was about to receive. Gelmit, who was feigning unconsciousness, waited until Rigger approached him, and as soon as he was close enough, he attacked Rigger. Due to my warning, Rigger wasn't completely caught by the attack, but that didn't stop him from getting a big burn on his back from Death March Dance. Despite that, the burn wasn't a big deal. The worst thing was that as Rigger's back was hit, most of the arrows in his quiver were sent away. Rigger had only 5 arrows left in his hands. Ahahahaha. Prepare to die, miserable goblin. At that moment, I felt like stepping in and finishing off that Majin once and for all, but I stopped myself from doing that. Even though he wanted to resolve this situation, protect Rigger and end that bastard's life, Rigger chose that fight. It was a fight to avenge Rigger's brother's name, so I couldn't pry. This revenge is his. I'll only get involved if it's extremely necessary. After all, I don't want people to get involved in my revenge. And now? What are you going to do? Now that you only have 5 arrows, how can you defeat me, I who have healing magic? As soon as Gelmit muttered this, healing magic began to work around his body. The leg ripped off by the arrow pulled itself together and the blow marks and blood began to drain from his body. So is this healing magic? It doesn't seem as efficient and is certainly much weaker than our potions. Honestly, I don't think it would be to my advantage to learn something like that, at least as long as I have reserves of potion in my stomach. Returning to combat, despite the pain in his back, Rigger recovered from the attack and got to his feet, moving away from Gelmit to gain space. A fierce, determined look adorned his face, one I hadn't seen in him until now. So this is the face a warrior wears when he's bent on revenge. Gelmit, do you really think your healing magic is good enough? So, why don't we test it out? And again, the battle began. Rigger started bouncing back and forth, reducing the cost of his spells by not using Shadow Step, probably keeping in mind that Gelmit had a lot more spells than he did and that he could keep up the stamina battle. The proof of this was how Gelmit fired his Death March dances non-stop at Rigger, trying to hit him. It became a battle for who gets a chance first. If Rigger fails to hit Gelmit, who has more spells than I do, he'll be at the mercy of a much more powerful person who uses magic constantly, but if Gelmit falters, even if it's just for a second, then Rigger will hit an arrow in one of your vital points. Also, if Gelmit's spells run out, he won't be able to heal himself with magic, which would also be his defeat. Of course, the sage predicted that Gelmit will likely try to flee before he runs out of magicules, but turning his back on the enemy would be foolish since the two are long-range fighters. And so the fight went on for a while. Gelmit attacked on one side, Rigger dodged on the other, all in order to maintain the advantage and avoid spending as much of his arrows as possible. In a gap that Gelmit left, probably when he started considering escaping, young Rigger took advantage of this moment and fired an arrow at the Majin, ending up with one of his arms being ripped from his body. Even so, Gelmit only healed the wound as he went, realizing that escaping before Rigger ran out of arrows would be difficult. Of course, Rigger wasn't made of iron either. Even though his stamina has increased a lot since his second evolution, Rigger still has a limit and, having to dodge the Majin's attacks, he was starting to get tired. If everything went at its current pace, Rigger might be too exhausted to continue before his opponent ran out of spells. Of course, I didn't ask the sage to predict the results. I don't want to know how it will end through the sage's mouth, but through my own eyes, I want to see Rigger defeat the enemy. And then, in a slip, Rigger tripped over the branch of a tree. It might have been just a second, but Gelmit wouldn't let it go. Die. Gathering dozens of Death March dances in his two arms, Gelmit fired several of his shots at Rigger, heading in 3 different directions. With the shots coming from 3 directions and the tree behind him, Rigger was totally cornered unless he used his Shadow Step, but like I'm going to die. Rigger loaded 3 of his 4 arrows into his bow, all at the same time, all aimed at Gelmit's shots, and then released them. I wouldn't even need my 6 supernatural senses to be activated. The glow of Rigger's aura on the arrows was enough to know the strength he had put into each one. As the 3 pairs of attacks met, 3 large explosions shook the air in the forest, and as a result, attacks from both sides nullified each other. Rigger was more tired between the two. This last attack seems to have been something that tired him a lot, but in terms of who spent more spells in the entire battle, that was definitely Gelmit. Even if only a little, if things continued as they were, Rigger was the one who would win this confrontation. There was only one problem. And now, Goblin, how are you going to face me if you have only 1 arrow? Rigger had only 1 arrow left in his arsenal, while Gelmit could fire a large number of his spells, which I had analyzed. Because they were relatively simple, using a combination of your battle spirit and charging it with spells like a spell, their usage was extremely simple. In the comparison between the two, Gelmit had plenty of strength while Rigger couldn't miss. Still, I didn't feel he would lose, even without using the sage to predict the outcome. And with that same determination that he would not lose, Rigger began to advance in a straight line towards Gelmit. I don't need more than that to defeat you. As soon as he shouted that, Rigger used Shadow Step and closed the distance between him and the Majin, appearing next to Gelmit. Perhaps because he was already prepared, Gelmit prepared the Death March dance at the same moment, aiming at Rigger, but he disappeared shortly after when using Shadow Step once more. I understood Rigger's train of thought in that moment. With a single arrow left over, having the opportunity to attack is more important than having the spells to keep shooting powerful arrows, so he went on the offensive using a skill like Shadow Step, non-stop. Yet this is a desperate measure. It's the same as getting into a resistance confrontation against Gelmit, who still has a lot more magic than he does. Seeing this made me question whether Rigger would really be able to win this battle, and for a second I really wanted to ask the sage who he predicted would win, but I decided not to. I had to believe in my subordinate, who I trained with all my might. Less than greater than have a little faith, sage, less than greater than. The battle between Rigger and Gelmit continued for a while longer. Each time Rigger appeared in one place, Gelmit automatically aimed a death march dance in the direction and fired, only to miss as Rigger had already used Shadow Step to appear in another place. A real battle of resistance that would test which of the two can hit the other first. And then, all was quiet. Rigger stopped appearing and Gelmit was looking for him with the death march dance in his hands. Even so, since Rigger didn't show up, all Gelmit could do was look for him and try to beat him in this little game of resistance, but now that he didn't show up, that would be next to impossible. Damn. Where's that bastard? Of course, my 6 supernatural senses could clearly see Rigger in the distance, aiming for Gelmit's head, who was looking for him as he started shooting in all directions out of frustration. Some of his shots even went to the sky. Where are you? Come out, you bastard. Before Gelmit could finish these words, Rigger released his last arrow. Charged with a fair amount of its aura, the arrow followed, ignoring every tree in the path it passed through a tris. It was almost as if the arrow was making curves to avoid hitting the trees. And indeed, she was. This is one of the battle spirit martial arts that Rigger and I developed for use by archers, straight shot. By creating an aura path that connects you and your target as if it were a road, it becomes possible to make the arrow follow that path, just like a car on a road. Although it was not possible to make very sharp turns, Rigger's arrow avoided branches, passing over one and under another, following a totally uncertain path. There was practically no way for Gelmit to dodge an arrow like that, and yet. The arrow collided with something invisible in the air, and then it fell to the ground. Calling it invisible is a mistake. My eyes were able to see the semi-transparent force field due to my 6 supernatural senses, but even I didn't expect Gelmit to be able to cast a defensive spell as strong and as fast as that arrow moved. It seems that combat instincts finally began to kick in this powerful Majin body that Gelmit possesses, which allowed him to start keeping up with Rigger. With that, Rigger lost his last arrow. Ha 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 ha, as expected of a worm like you. I will send you to hell and then I will make the other inhabitants of that little village with you. Death March Dance. As soon as Gelmit muttered this, the attacks he had fired in random directions and which had soared above the height of the trees, which had apparently been standing still until now, converged towards the Rigger. As I was focused on the fight, I wasn't able to see that the attacks lingered, so I was unable to react in time. Numerous explosions surrounded Rigger, scorching his clothes with the burns of magic. The strength was such that, had his clothes not been part of a special set made by me, it is very likely that they would have been destroyed, offering even less defense to his body. Still, they endured, slightly reducing the damage Rigger received. Seeing Rigger in this state made Gelmit burst out laughing. Ha 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 ha. That's what you get for messing with me, you miserable goblin. After I kill you, I'm going to go back to that village and send the villagers to hell with you. Gelmit muttered those words, malice escaping every part of his body as he prepared a death march dance larger and more powerful than the others above his hand, ready to launch. Even so, he continued walking as apparently he wanted to fire the death march dance from a point where he could see Rigger's death. During that time, I took the opportunity to connect with Rigger with my thought transmission. No, Rigger. Laughs Rimuru-sama. Forgive me, I failed. He looked defeated. Even though his voice was just being conveyed by thought, the pain was clear in his words. He had really lost to Gelmit. After all, he lost the will to fight from the moment his arrows ran out. You said who was it? And who was the one you were going to avenge? Rimuru-sama. Prepare to die, miserable goblin. But don't worry, soon your dear friends will be able to greet you in hell. Gelmit had gotten close enough to watch Rigger and started pointing the palm of his hand in his direction. The death march dance wavered a bit unsteadily due to the amount of energy it had accumulated, but there was no doubt that with the power of this thing, Rigger's clothes, which were made for more mobility and less defense, would not withstand the power of the blast. Still, Gelmit shivered the moment he saw Rigger's fierce, determined gaze, which was staring at him hard. I'm not just any goblin, Majin. I'm Rigger. Rigger Tempest, and I'll avenge my dead brother by ripping his head off. Huh? And how are you going to do that? Right after shouting that, Gelmit fired. A shot much more powerful than all his previous shots, and a shot I might have had trouble dealing with myself if I didn't have my unique skill, Predator, on my side. Still, I wasn't worried. I knew Rigger would get through this after all. Strict. You are the Acker of the Tempest clan. I do not allow you to die. None of my subordinates are allowed to die yet. Less than warning, Rigger Tempest individual has less than a 2.3% chance to escape with health from this attack. Immediate action is suggested. Greater than. Calm down, Sage. Did I not tell you before? Just have a little faith. Go to hell, you miserable goblin, as I said. Before Gelmit knew it, the death march dance he had fired at Rigger had disappeared in a massive explosion. She didn't hit Rigger, on the contrary, before hitting him something hit her, forcing her to disperse, but not only that, that something moved on. That something was an arrow? Gelmit didn't have time to think. The arrow, much faster than all the previous ones, took his arm before the Majin even noticed. And, before he could cry out in pain, surprise and terror adorned his face as what was left of his arm began to petrify. Okay, I know I mentioned having faith, but what happened?